Hey all, my name is Ed, and this is Personally, our community podcast. And we're back with season 2 with more interesting startup founders. In this next episode, I'm going to talk to one of the most interesting founders I met in the last couple of weeks. Today I'm talking to Sarah Huggins. She's the co-founder of Hiive. Hiive is a groundbreaking online marketplace that's reshaping the trading of private securities. Sarah is a strategist at heart, and she's passionate for complex environments like this. Let's dive into her insights and talk to Sarah now. Sarah, thank you so much for the time. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you today, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here too. And I've been following Hive and seeing a lot of the great things you're working on. I would imagine you're very busy with the latest news and also congrats on that. I would say before we even start in the conversation, maybe share a little bit about what's Hive and who's Sarah so we get the conversation going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Hive is a marketplace for private stock. We bring together buyers and sellers of stock in private companies. So, private companies are companies like Persona, actually. So, usually private VC backed companies that are, 500 million plus valuation. We facilitate trades in those companies through our marketplace platform.
That's great. That's great. And Sarah, I know you've been like working with legal, you have like a decade plus experience in that, and you're becoming an entrepreneur. Now you're building a business. I would imagine there are a lot of changes, but also a lot of similar skills that you have to apply. Can you share a little bit about this journey of your transition from a legal world into like entrepreneurial world, even though they apply, I have to say a lot of the skills apply, maybe a little bit about how did that came to be, how does that feel for you and some of the transferable skills you had to apply to it.
Yeah, so you're correct. I started my career as a lawyer. It's funny because I always wanted to be a lawyer when I was a kid. And I think it's because I was a little bit precocious, perhaps, and like to have a good argument with the adults around me. And so they naturally uh, concluded that I would make a good lawyer. So I wanted to be a lawyer, but I always had in the background this real entrepreneurial itch, I would say. And so there were a lot of lemonade stands, or I would grab the apples from my parents' tree in the backyard and try to hawk those on the street corner. So it was kind of natural, I think, that one day, or inevitable maybe, that one day I would become an entrepreneur. Of course, I did end up going the law school route. I went to university, and the natural next step was to go to law school and get a law degree. And then I ended up practicing law for almost a decade. And I actually really loved it. And so a lot of people assume that if you leave law, it's because you are very, disenchanted with the profession overall. And in my case, I wasn't. I actually enjoyed a lot of what I was doing, but that entrepreneurial itch that started when I was a kid continued. It never really let up. And I knew that one day I had to do something for myself. So I've actually had, I had and still have a restaurant business, believe it or not. That was my first entrepreneurial venture. And the most definitely not what I would recommend anyone do if they want to dip their toes in the entrepreneurial waters, because it is really an entrepreneurial trial by fire. There's a lot of things that you have to master, and it's obviously very difficult to succeed, as most people know. So I did that for a number of years. Before I partnered up with my co-founders to start Hiive in 2021. I think, it's not that common actually for lawyers to transition to entrepreneurial pursuits. I don't have any data on that, but that's that's the impression that I get. I know a lot of lawyers and I have a lot of contact with the legal profession. And I don't necessarily think that's because lawyers make bad entrepreneurs. I think that's probably has more to do with the fact that when you leave law school at whatever it is, 25, and you get a 6-figure job working, in a big corporate law firm, it's tough at that point. You adjust your lifestyle accordingly and you learn to live a particular way. And it's not necessarily top of mind to walk away from that stability. That being said, I don't think that lawyers make bad entrepreneurs. I think as you asked about transferable skills, and I think there are actually quite a few. There are a lot of legal issues in every business. And especially in ours, we could talk more about that later. We are in a highly regulated business. And I think one of the things I've noticed being an entrepreneur for all these years is that the things that might scare me if I wasn't a lawyer don't really phase me. I have enough awareness of the law and all the various constellation of risks and opportunities that when something does come up or a legal issue does rear its head, I have a pretty, you know, shrug the shoulders response to it for the most part, which I think can be very empowering, that I don't have this idea of the law as being something that I don't understand. So that can be, I think, very helpful. The other thing is we talk a lot, or, you've probably heard that phrase, think like a lawyer. Lawyers are taught to think and behave in a particular way. And I would say what characterizes that way of thinking is looking at problems from many different angles. So taking a problem and being able to sort of see the 360-degree view around that problem, and then seeing maybe a whole bunch of different risks, opportunities, solutions to that problem. And that's something that comes up in my entrepreneurship for me every day. The sort of the opposite side of that, or there's kind of a downside to that as well, which is that you do as a lawyer see the roadblocks and the risks in everything. And I think if you let that, it can be quite paralyzing and it can slow you down. And when you're in an early stage growth business like we are now, you need to be very flexible. You need to act decisively. You need to act quickly. You cannot be completely roadblocked by your perception of risk. You need to see a risk and make a decision in the face of that risk. So I think that's one thing that I'm constantly working on. That's sort of like the lawyer's handicap that I have to work on every day. But as long as you're aware of it, I think it's something that you can manage.
It makes so much sense. And I love the points that you mentioned here. Well, first of all, when you mentioned the restaurant, I was like, is it like the bear, like the series? Is it that tough? I don't want to be like in that business ever. I would imagine, as you said, it prepares you for the worst. Um, but even like in a business where you're like coming from your background of like, legal, doing a lot of analysis, looking at different perspectives, um, it opens up opportunities for so many things. And like given this, like using your expertise to apply to like tackling little problems up to like bigger issues that you're probably going to face in the future. But to your point, also creates this analysis paralysis where you're like, am I overanalyzing this and not moving, as fast as I should? But I guess it sounds like you have the right balance because coming from the restaurant plus law, I think you got the two like ultra fast, like has to be done now. I think a restaurant world is like very immediate. And now we have the balance of like, okay, it's a complex business, but we also have to move fast, but it's not as crazy fast as a restaurant maybe.
The restaurant commands immediacy. It's interesting actually, because when I started the restaurant business, people, friends of mine thought I was crazy. By the way, obviously, many of them were lawyers and professionals. They wondered what the heck I was doing. And they said, well, are you going to like work in the kitchen? And I said, of course not. I'm going to hire people to work in the kitchen. Well, I mean, of course, that was my plan, to hire people to work in the kitchen. But I would say the first year, there wasn't a day that went by when I didn't end up in the kitchen. And I would say to this day, if you come and tell me, if you're like applying for a job at Hiive and you include your line cook experience on your resume, like I'm going to take a pretty good look at your resume, because that is a very tough job. Being a line cook in a busy restaurant is one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I've done a lot of hard things, but that was very challenging. When you have like the chits printing or displaying on the screen, in a modern restaurant, they do not stop. The customers do not stop. It doesn't matter what is going on in the kitchen, whether you're running out of food, the orders do not stop coming in. And it can be almost like, there were moments when I was working in that kitchen that I almost wanted to walk out. We have, I don't know, 20 chits that are not made, 20 plates that we have not even yet looked at. This will take us 20 minutes. Our goal time is 10 minutes from order to delivery to the customer. And I had an amazing kitchen manager who would say, Sarah, there's only one way to do this, and that is one plate at a time. You can't think 10 plates ahead. If you think 10 plates ahead, if you try to make 4 plates at once, you will fail. And you won't be able to deliver any of the plates to your customer. You need to take the first plate, you need to make it, you need to put it on the pass, and then you need to go to the second plate. And I remember that. I mean, I think there's like a lot that has a lot of general application to a lot of things that we do. And oftentimes when I find myself in a very challenging situation, I like have this cook echoing through, the words of this cook echoing through my brain, like one plate at a time. That's it.
I love that. I love that. I should apply this to my life because
Yeah.
I feel like it's easy to get distracted and just like try and do multiple things at the same time. And it's not even like this, just pure distractions. Essentially, like, you have a lot of projects that you have to juggle, but if you try and keep them going and like not finish any of them, it just makes it harder and harder because your brain is not functioning the same way it should be. So I love that. This is a great idea, and I love the advice. Um, Having said that, I mean, shifting gears a little bit, but still thinking about like building businesses and tackling problems. I would imagine that at some point, you and your co-founder thought about, okay, let's build a business around. I mean, I would imagine that. I don't know how did that come to fruition, but at some point, you're like, okay, this is the problem we want to solve. Because usually, companies start with like a problem that you're like facing yourself or you like observed, and like maybe we can tackle this. But yours is quite complex. Hive is not solving something simple. So would you mind telling me a little bit more about like how did this come to be? Did this come like as an idea first? Was this like something that was already like in prototype stages and you just jumped in and started like to make this turn into like a company? I'd love to hear like the really initial stages of this from an idea into like, okay, let's make this happen as a business.
Yeah. So my co-founders had been working in the secondary market for stakes in these VC-backed companies for many years before I joined them. They were brokers. So they were doing the good old-fashioned getting on the phone, getting on email, connecting buyers and sellers, trying to make deals happen. And really saw an opportunity. I mean, funny enough, the stakes that they were trading or the deals that they were making were in these extremely innovative companies. And oftentimes they were marketplace companies and fintech companies. And they said, wait a second, we are, we are intermediating stakes in these exceptionally innovative companies using really old school methodologies. And they saw an opportunity to revolutionize the way that they were operating and the service that they were providing. There was, I think, the main opportunity was to bring centralization, automation, and transparency that would enable better price discovery, better information in the market, and ultimately increase liquidity. And in any market, and particularly in this one, liquidity is the holy grail. That's what you need, right? That's the end stage. That's the goal. And so so they were doing this in the good old fashioned way, right? And there was like lots of brokers in the market, and there's some, pretty sketchy practices going on, and there's some information flying about and whatnot. And on the other hand, there's companies, private companies, issuers who recognize that there is a need in the market to create liquidity in their stock, right? Their employees certainly, a lot of employees hold stock. I'm sure there's lots of employees of Persona who hold Persona stock. And they may at some point want to find liquidity in that stock, whether it's to buy a house, put kids through private school, pay off debts, what have you. So there was a need and a desire that these companies had to create liquidity in their stock. And they were kind of facing a couple of suboptimal options, right? The first is to use what most people are pretty familiar with, and that's called a tender offer. It's usually company sponsored liquidity. And it's costly, it's cumbersome, and in our experience, kind of can create some pretty suboptimal outcomes in terms of pricing and create what's generally maybe a little bit of a disappointment for all of the participants. And on the other hand, there was this sort of traditional brokered market where maybe companies might be upset that brokers were flogging their stock at prices that they were comfortable with, or with a dearth of information, or some information that wasn't necessarily correct, or perhaps some of these brokers were even unregistered. This is a very regulated market, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And so we really saw this opportunity is how do we create liquidity? How do we use transparency, automation, centralization to kind of create the best of both of these worlds? So to eliminate a lot of the problems associated with each of them. So give those issuers some of the control that they need, right? Some of the insight that they need into how the market for their stock is going to operate. And then on the other hand, you know, capitalize on the magic of open market forces to create best execution, to drive prices that actually reflect the value of the stock and so on. And so that's kind of where we're coming in, is how do we create the best of both worlds here with an open market and more of like the tender offer model, to really create the optimal opportunity for liquidity in the private equity or venture backed secondary market. And that's what we're doing with Hiive. And that was the opportunity that they saw because they had been working in this market for so many years.
That makes so much sense. And I love this approach where I think there are several ways in how you can approach a business idea. And one of them is what you just mentioned. Like you have better ways, more innovative ways of doing one thing that has been happening for a while. And if you think about, I don't know, if we're looking at ride sharing, like take a lift with someone, now it becomes like the Uber of something. And now if like, okay, I want to sell, I want to have liquidity my stocks, and what's the way to do it, like, and there's the boring way, the complex way, maybe there's a better way. And again, to your point, like you've been doing this, you have the expertise, so I love this idea. That's great. And I would imagine that in the fintech world, again, you have the idea, you're like, we've been doing this, let's get started. You navigate through some complexities, but even the world of fintech has been changing a lot, regulations change a lot. Probably your legal, the lawyer hat there helps a lot, but I would love to hear more about like some of these challenges they've been facing and how do you tackle them?
Yeah, so that's sort of how I got involved, right? Because as you allude to, like fintech space and this space in particular, it can be very complex from a regulation perspective. So I would say that's sort of the biggest challenge. When we set out to build this business and I got involved with it, which was early in 2021, we actually had to start with the question, believe it or not, are we even allowed to do this? Right? Not, there's, I would say few businesses where you have to start with that like very basic question, but ours was one of them. And so the answer was indeed yes, but we are operating within a very complex regulatory framework. So before we could even make a dollar, before we could really operate this business at all, we had to be registered as a FINRA broker dealer and an SEC, that Security Exchange Commission regulated alternative trading system. So this is not easy to accomplish. It took us, I think, outside of 8 months to get licensed in order to do this. And obviously, like lots of paperwork associated with that, lots of planning. So you have to give a lot of for it. You can't just start. You have to think in advance. What's the next year? What's the next 2 years going to look like? Now, I think those were kind of anticipated challenges. We knew that we would need to grapple with those, and that was something that I was familiar with in my many years practicing law. Regulation didn't really scare me. I think one of the surprising things, though, was some of the other challenges we faced because we were regulated. So I'll give you one example, which is that not all banks, as it turns out, will work with regulated businesses, will work with broker dealers. If you're in the marijuana business, for example, it is very difficult to find a bank. If you were in the broker dealer business, somewhat easier. But we went through an onboarding process with one bank. I think 12 weeks of all of the paperwork associated with bank onboarding. And at the end of it, they effectively told us, oops, sorry, we just realized we're not able to support broker dealer banking. So that was like a lot of frustration, time wasted for something that I honestly wouldn't have even necessarily kind of crossed my mind when we first set out to do this. There was another challenge we faced is that when you are a FINRA broker dealer, for the first year of operation, all of your marketing materials have to actually be vetted. Vetted is perhaps not the word, but they have to be submitted to FINRA, which is the self-regulating organization that regulates broker dealers. They have to be submitted to FINRA through a special procedure. And then you have a 10-day holding period where you cannot use those marketing materials. So, well, you can imagine when you're an early stage company, like you are trying to just get stuff out there as quickly as possible. And we had that constraint on us, which made things
Wow.
more difficult than they already were. On the other hand, I would say this kind of regulation, these kinds of constraints, they do, I would say, create opportunity. And one of the things that I noticed, or that I noticed in looking back, is that as a result of having these constraints and having these regulatory requirements imposed on us virtually from day one, we had to create processes and structures that most early stage companies would not have. So when I think about our financial record keeping, for example, I'm going to use the
Mhm.
word impeccable. Perhaps that's strong, but it is because we have no choice effectively, right? There's
Mhm.
just not a lot of opportunities to cut corners. When you are a regulated business, you are under the microscope. And I think that creates an opportunity to innovate in process and operations. And it ensures that, like in our case, we have very little what I would describe as operational debt because we just couldn't. That wasn't an option for us.
Wow. Oh my God. And I mean, it sounds super complex, but at the same time, I feel like this is so important. With all of these scams and things that happens in the fintech world, knowing that you're like regulated, that you've gone through like all of this, it puts people at easy. But it's also a lot of behind the scenes, right? I mean, a lot of this that you're sharing is like behind the scenes that you had to do to make sure that you're even like up and running, like you can operate legally. But then as a customer, you're like, okay, how can I trust this company, right? Because I would imagine that you see this a lot. Like, I mean, you had the finance, you have FTX, and a lot of cases where, okay, what happened here? Were they, was there something like wrong there? Is there something that's fishy or is like too good to be true? And I would imagine like any fintech would challenge, like have that the challenge of the trust that you have to build with your community, your end users before they even sign up. Um, and I would love to hear like from you, like, and how are you now building trust and how do you ensure that, people can trust, Hive and okay, you've been doing all of this work, and you now need to make this, the users need to see that and feel that, okay, you've done all the work for us, but what else are you doing to build trust with them?
Yeah, I think obviously, particularly today, trust in this market is really fundamental. And I think in this particular space, which is brokering private stock in the secondary market, it's kind of historically maybe been a missing piece in the equation. And so for us, when we were setting out to build this, it was really critical. How do we build trust? And then how do you build and tell the story that you can be trusted, but then maintain it and include that as part of like every interaction that you have with all of the stakeholders in your business? um, so I would say, we're constantly thinking about this, and there's a few ways that I think we do it really well. I think the first way is not really unique to our business, but that when you're building a product and you're offering it to your users, you build a lot of trust when your product does the things that you say it does, right? And so in our case, if you purport to be a marketplace for private stock, you need to be able to deliver on that. And I think that's something that we've been really prioritized, and it's something that we've actually been able to do really well. So that, I can say I think that we have really great execution. Like if there is a deal to be done in this market, then I think the one place that it can be done is on the Hive platform. So trust is created because we say we have something and we actually do, we can deliver on it. So that's the first thing. Second, I think we've built our product around a lot of notions of transparency around fees and market pricing. If you pick any issuer on the Hive platform, you go take a look at that company. Once you're logged in, you can see a price chart. You can see where it has traded historically on the Hive platform. You can see where there are listings. You can see where there are bids. And some people say we're crazy to give away this kind of data. But we don't think that there can be the kind of liquidity that we dream of without that level of transparency. Third, I've touched on this being a very highly regulated business. I think in a regulated business, you have to have integrity. Obviously, that's a requirement of the regulator, but that has to spill over into your entire organization. So it's one of Hive's core values. It's probably one of every company's core values, but we talk a lot about it in our business. We talk a lot about it internally. It's something that we simply can't ignore, and we've done a lot of things to really weave it into the fabric of our everyday conversations and the way that we conduct our business and the way that we treat our employees. Like, what is integrity? Like, It's obviously about being trustworthy, but I think it goes all the way down to how you treat people, whether it's your colleagues, it's your clients, but also your friends and those with whom you have other relationships outside of work, right? So when we are hiring and we are evaluating people, integrity is really core to success, I think, at Hive. And then the other piece is we've taken a lot of steps to really integrate compliance. And that's such a boring word. And I know every company grapples with a different version of compliance, right? And at Persona, you literally compliance is your business. um, but how do you make compliance less of an afterthought and more that something like right at the forefront of your business is something that people are forced to confront every day? And for us, a big part of this was internalizing all of our compliance functions very, very early in our business. So a lot of broker dealers will, for example, outsource their chief compliance officer duties. And that is something that we did in the early days and something that we are now bringing in-house, so that there is someone sitting in the middle of the office whose responsibility is to be in charge of or oversee compliance. So it's less regarded as like this sort of policing function and more just part of the deeply held beliefs or culture of the business, that this is the way we operate. We operate with transparency. We operate in a way that exudes integrity in all respects. And I think that's really important to building trust with your regulators, trust with your customers and your users, and also trust with the people inside your organization, your employees and your contractors.
That makes so much sense. And I love this point. I think there are a lot of insights here. I'll try to navigate through some of them. One thing that you mentioned, and when you mentioned that having like a chief compliance officer, reminds me of something I've learned with businesses, which is you do never outsource what's core to your business. And if you're like in a highly regulated business, having like outsourced, lawyers or compliance teams and fraud analysts and all makes it really hard for you to maintain that business at scale. Having that in-house from day one helps you a lot. First, learn about it, but second, it's core to your business. You can't fail there, because if you do fail, you're out of business. It's not like, a marketing material that, like, if it doesn't go well, it's just a marketing piece that you can like create a new one. Maybe a campaign didn't go well as well, but it's different, right? It's a different, it's part of the core. Like, being compliant is part of that core, and it's super important, as well as the transparency. I think this is so important. I feel like so much connection to with like how Persona works, culturally. And we're like so open, internally. We share things, we share challenges, we share wins, and it makes every employee more connected to the company and to the big vision. So I love that. I think these are really good points, and it makes so much sense, because you kind of can trust, more when you feel like that everyone is engaged, everyone is on the same page, everyone is seeing the same thing. There's no like, misunderstanding of like, oh, we said this, but it's said saying something else on the public page. It's not. I think this transparency is super important, and I love that. Um, Kind of like on that note, still, I know that part of like even what we do, and part of like what you have to do is verifying customers, making sure that they are who they say they are, and all of that. And I remember, because I recently moved to San Francisco, and I remember going to like marketplaces on like Facebook, and then you go to like this rental websites, and you kind of don't feel like you can trust that much. You're like, okay, it looks too good to be true. Is this house legit? Is this place, decent? Can I walk in there? Is this what it is? And then I remember seeing this company, again, same thing. They were like just a rental agency, but you had to do your KYC, which essentially you have to take a picture of your identity, and then take a picture of your selfie to verify that you are who you say you are. And for some reason, I just felt I could trust it more, because it's like, okay, they're vetting me. So I would assume they're doing the same for whoever is offering that room or that house or that apartment. So I can trust it a little bit more. And I went through that. And I know this is like, again, one of the little things that will help. Do you have like some sort of like verification in place that it helps like your customers, and being it end users or being in businesses that are like, okay, now I kind of feel like it's more legit, because they're checking me, they're vetting me. So I'd imagine they're doing the same for all the offerings that they have in place. Do you have that sort of like verification as well?
Yeah, we do. So one of the core parts, or kind of the key pieces of broker dealer compliance, is KYC. You've got to know your customer effectively. You've got to know who these people are. Make sure they are who they say they are effectively. And that's a core part of compliance in a number of industries. And when we set out to build Hiive and to build this platform, one of the things that I wanted to make sure was that we were as innovative about meeting our compliance obligations as we were about matching buyers and sellers of private stock. And then it wouldn't make sense to be very innovative in one place and then be old fashioned in another place. I think banks, and certainly where I live in Canada, the big banks are perfect examples of this. They have all of these, um, very somewhat innovative ways of like completing banking tasks. And yet when you want to enroll as a client of the bank, you have to fill in these PDFs and photocopy or scan your passport. And I did not want that experience at all. And so we spoke to Persona, I think, before we had even stood up our platform. And I brought in our CPTO to the conversation very, very early so that we could figure out how to integrate this automated identity verification, and not just identity verification, but another requirement which is related to anti-money laundering, so verifying people's identities against various watch lists and so on. We integrated that almost from the beginning, when financially, I'll be honest, it didn't make necessarily sense to do that, right? It was like the old sort of shooting a fly with a gun expression. It was a great decision. And now that our volumes are much higher, it makes a lot of sense. But I agree with you. I think that it brings a level of consistency to the onboarding process. And I think that extra step gives people reassurance that, yes, we are vetting you, but that means we are vetting everybody else as well by these sort of set of basic requirements.
Yeah, that's a good point. I love that. And I have a feeling that Hive is getting to this point where you have a potential to really disrupt the traditional private and equity trading. And I think you mentioned that, the new approach to things, you have the expertise in house, and it seems like things are starting to take off, really. What do you believe is like the future of private securities and trading, and how do you feel Hive is positioned to really win in the future?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think Hive is positioned to win. I'm glad you think so too. um, I think we believe that the future of the process, or the finding a buyer and seller for private stock and closing the sale, will be an automated process. Effectively, right now it is a long and cumbersome and uncertain process, and I don't think it needs to be. And I think a lot of people have assumed that maybe we can innovate around the margins of this business, but at the end of the day, there's all of these things that stand in the way that prevent it from being truly automated the way that the public markets are. And we just don't agree with that. I think that there's, the future of private stock trading is effectively very similar to using a platform like Robinhood to trade public stock, to buy or sell public stock. We've come a long way to this goal, and we think that it's not that far away.
That's great. That's great. And I think one last question, but I feel this is probably something that as you evolved, from like being the founder or maybe a small team, probably you and your co-founders, to now being a leader, because now you have a team, you're operating, you have more people who are relying on you. How do you approach, culture at a company as you grow, and keep sane as well? Because I know it can be very challenging and sometimes can be very lonely for a founder. How do you keep like, the culture going and keep like this mindset as of a leader as you're growing with Hive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I'm the chief operating officer and general counsel of the business. So those are actually two very big roles. And in the first role as the COO, I actually have spent and continue to spend a lot of time thinking about culture and what that means for a business like ours. I would get this question almost from day one when people would interview for roles. There would be like two or three of us employed by the company, and I would be interviewing for someone for a job, and they would ask me like, "What's the culture of the organization like?" And so I've had to be thinking about this from virtually day one. I think it's a mistake, as I've thought about it a lot. I think it's a mistake to regard culture as something that can be truly manufactured. I think by perks or events or putting a list of values on the wall. I think that culture is created by the humans that form an organization. And when people would ask me this in the early days, what's the culture like? I was like, well, it kind of depends on what you're like. if you choose to join us, right? Culture is as dynamic as humans are. And that's what makes it really exciting, really fun, and also what makes it a real challenge. It's not something that you can always wrap your arms around. It's not something that is easy to describe. It's behaviors. It's the way people look at the world. It's the way they work together, right? A culture that is, 10 people, you bring in two other people, the culture can change, right? And that's pretty exciting for me. I love that, but it does make it a lot more challenging than I think I ever thought it would be. I thought culture was something you could more tightly control. And I think the other thing I would say about culture is something I've learned over the years is to be very upfront with myself and then with others inside of the organization and those who are thinking of joining the organization about what culture kind of uniformly looks like in an early stage growth company. And we tend to want to sort of give people all the things that they want to make their work as satisfying as possible, right? And we can't necessarily give that to all people. So if you are someone who really seeks stability, a clear career path, they want to know exactly what the company is going to be doing in the next day, week, month, or year, that is very hard to deliver on in an early stage company. It's just the reality. And so any attempts to sort of, bring that type of certainty often do fail. And it's better to just acknowledge, what, we are trying to be disruptive. We are trying to be agile. We are trying to be flexible. We're trying all those good things. And that is at times, and sometimes all the time, very chaotic, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't always know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty. And there are some people, and I would describe myself as one of those who thrive on that chaos, who thrive on that uncertainty. They love it. They wake up every day wondering, what is today going to bring? And that really gives them the energy that they need to bring their best self to whatever they're doing. And I think it's really important to be honest. We are that company right now. We probably won't always be that company. Eventually, we will have a little bit more certainty and stability, but we are that company. And the best thing that we can do for our people is to be honest with them about that and to bring into the fold those people who thrive under those really shifting conditions.
I love that, and I resonate so much with that. It feels like a little bit of how Persona is operating, where you have ambiguity. Every day is a new day, but it's also great because it gives opportunities for a lot of new things to flourish. I really really resonate with that, and I feel you're right. If you have the right people at the right place, and give them like, okay, this is your playground, because there's no like definition of what's gonna happen here. It's a little bit of like, this is the vision, this is roughly where we're gonna go. Maybe it will change, but let's go together, and I'll support you in that. And I think this is really a great mindset to have. I love that.
Yeah, I think it really is. I posted something on LinkedIn today. Last week, we had an on-site. Our entire team most of our team is here actually with us in the office. That actually, I should mention, is a huge part of our culture at this early stage. But we do have some people who work remotely, and they came in from out of town, and we spent an amazingly electric week together. And I couldn't resist but post on LinkedIn a bunch of photos of everybody hanging out that week and just observing and remarking on how fun it was. And that if you thrive on this, on working in an early stage startup, then life is fun. It's so fun. It's so fun. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I'm just a big nerd who thinks that work is fun, but it just lights me up every day to get out of bed and join my team in accomplishing the many things that we have on our roadmap. It's so exciting. I love what I do. I'm so lucky.
Oh, I love that. That's so good and so inspiring to hear that. Having said that, sir, if people want to follow you or hear more about Hive, what's up and running, what's happening, is there like a website or any social links that you want to share with people?
Yeah, so we would definitely invite you to come check out our website where you can link up with our marketplace. So that's Hiive, Hiive markets.com. You can find us on LinkedIn. We're pretty active over on LinkedIn, somewhat less active elsewhere in social media for a bunch of reasons. But definitely LinkedIn and our website are the best ways to find us.
That's great. Thank you so much for the time, Sarah. It was really, really good having this conversation. I felt inspired and I actually took notes on new things to do. So thank you so much and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, good. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Ed.
And if you like this podcast, make sure that you share this with founders, members of your community, team members, and also you can join Persona's startup program. Go to withpersona.com/startups and you can apply to join now. Thank you.